I want you to imagine something, just for a second. Picture an object barely the weight of two standard paper clips.
Right. So we are talking maybe 4 or 5 grams in total.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I want you to imagine that this tiny, almost weightless thing sitting quietly in your lower back, right above your kidneys, essentially dictates how you survive every single threat you will ever face.
And I mean every threat.
Right. Whether that is a literal charging bear in the woods or, just a terrifying late-night email from your boss.
It really functions as the great equalizer of human physiology, because it doesn't actually matter what the stressor is. Those few grams of tissue are what translate the outside world's chaos into your body's physical internal response.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the body's ultimate stress responders, the adrenal glands. Because for something that small, they punch way, way above their weight class.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they act as the human body's ultimate panic button, but as we're going to see, they're also its long-term endurance style.
Yeah, and our roadmap for this deep dive is to basically figure out the actual mechanics of that panic button.
Right.
So we are going to explore what these glands actually are, which is a structural mystery in its own right. We will look at the history of how we discovered their purpose, including a massive presidential medical secret.
Which is such a crazy story.
It really is. And we'll break down how they operate as this bizarre dual factory of hormones. And finally, we will look at why understanding the biology of the adrenal system is the absolute key to surviving modern chronic stress.
Let's unpack the anatomy first, because the historical confusion here is just, well, it's kind of hilarious.
Oh, completely.
If you look back at early anatomists, they had absolutely no idea what to make of these things. You've got Bartolomeo Ustachi back in 1563, and he essentially just throws his hands up.
Right.
He documents them, but he literally calls them glands of unknown function.
Well, you have to consider the medical paradigm of the 16th century. Back then, if an organ did something, you could usually trace how it did it through visible plumbing.
Like tubes and ducts.
Exactly. The pancreas or the salivary glands, for example, have physical ducts. You can visually trace the tube to see where the fluids go.
Right.
But the adrenal glands don't have ducts. They just sit there perched on top of the kidneys like tiny triangular hats, just completely self-contained.
Which is actually where the name comes from. From Latin, ad meaning toward, and renes meaning kidneys.
Right.
And I know some people call them suprarenal glands for the exact same reason. They were just sitting superior to the kidneys.
Yeah.
But because there was no obvious plumbing, medical science essentially ignored them for centuries.
Yeah, but the structural mystery goes so much deeper than just missing plumbing. I mean, the most crucial foundational fact to understand about the adrenal gland is that it is not actually one organ.
Wait, really?
No, it's two completely different organs with entirely different embryonic origins and jobs that are just sharing a single outer capsule.
So it's basically two organs in a trench coat.
That is exactly what it is. Structurally, you have an outer layer called the adrenal cortex and an inner core called the adrenal medulla.
Okay.
And the outer cortex is this slow-burning steroid hormone factory. Developmentally, it's made of mesodermal tissue, which, to give you some biological context, that is the exact same embryonic lineage as the gonads, so the testes and ovaries.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I'm picturing this right.
Sure.
The outside is essentially reproductive-style steroid-producing tissue. But the inner core, the medulla, that is neural tissue, right? Brain tissue.
Yeah, it's neural tissue.
How did a piece of the nervous system and a piece of the reproductive system end up just fused together on top of the kidneys?
It is a bizarre embryonic quirk. The adrenal medulla, that inner core, is essentially a modified sympathetic nerve ganglion.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
So in a normal nervous system, a sympathetic ganglion is a cluster of nerve cells that sends long axons out, like wires, to specific organs to deliver neurotransmitters.
Right, like standard wiring.
Exactly. But the adrenal medulla never grew those axons. Instead, it just sits there, taking electrical signals from the nervous system, and when it gets triggered, it dumps its neurotransmitters straight into the bloodstream as hormones.
Wow, so you've got this slow-burn steroid factory on the outside and a lightning-fast, modified chunk of brain tissue on the inside just cooperating to keep you alive.
It is incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
But if their anatomy is this confusing historical accident of fused tissues, how did medical science finally untangle what this double organ actually does?
Well, that untangling started in 1855 with a physician in London named Thomas Addison. He was working at Guy's Hospital, quietly collecting autopsy cases of patients who had all died with a very strange constellation of symptoms.
What kind of symptoms?
They suffered profound weakness, massive weight loss, terribly low blood pressure, and this striking bronze discoloration of their skin.
Wow, okay.
And in every single case, when he performed the autopsy, he found the adrenal glands were completely destroyed, usually by tuberculosis.
So this was a massive paradigm shift. I mean, Addison proved that you could die from the failure of an internal secretion.
Exactly.
The word hormone wouldn't even be invented for another 50 years. But he basically birthed the entire field of endocrinology right there. And this condition of adrenal failure is actually still called Addison's disease today.
Which brings us to one of the most famous medical secrets of the 20th century. John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, he was officially diagnosed in 1947 and lived with severe adrenal insufficiency throughout his entire presidency.
Which is fascinating because from what we read in the sources, his 1960 campaign actively kept this diagnosis out of the press.
They completely denied it.
Yeah, and it makes the biology of his symptoms incredibly interesting in hindsight because you look at photos of JFK and he always had this perpetual glowing tan.
Right, everyone thought he just looked incredibly healthy and vigorous.
But that bronze skin was actually the exact symptom Thomas Addison described a century earlier.
It's a brilliant example of biology hiding in plain sight. But we have to ask why the skin turns bronze when the adrenal glands fail.
Right. What's the mechanism there?
It comes down to a precursor protein in the brain called POMC. When your adrenal glands are failing, your brain realizes there is a massive deficit.
Okay.
So it desperately screams at the adrenals to produce more hormones by pumping out a chemical signal called ACTH, that's adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adreno for the gland, cortico for the cortex, and tropic meaning to stimulate.
So the brain is flooding the body with ACTH, essentially trying to whip a dead horse. But how does that change skin color?
Think of that precursor protein, POMC, as a giant sheet of raw metal at a manufacturing plant.
Okay, I'm with you.
When the brain wants to make the ACTH signal, it has to physically stamp it out of that larger sheet of metal. But when it cuts out the ACTH, the leftover scrap metal happens to be the exact molecular shape of melanocyte-stimulating hormone.
Oh, wow. So you literally cannot make the stress signal without accidentally manufacturing the skin-darkening hormone as a byproduct.
Precisely. Chronically elevated ACTH inherently means chronically elevated melanocyte-stimulating hormone. It triggers the pigment cells in your skin.
That is wild.
So the darker skin is a visible biological map of the brain desperately trying to communicate with a failing gland.
Okay, so Addison figures out the gland is essential for life, and we eventually understand the brain's signaling mechanism.
Right.
But what about the actual chemicals the gland produces?
Right.
Because in 1901, Yokichi Takamine, a Japanese-American chemist, manages to isolate the active compound from that inner core, the medulla, and he names it adrenaline.
Which was a huge milestone. I mean, this wasn't just a discovery about the adrenal glands. This was the very first hormone ever isolated in pure crystalline form.
That's amazing.
Yeah, he beat the discovery of insulin by 2 decades.
And then we get to the 1930s and Hans Selye. And Selye's experiments with rats are, well, they're a classic case of failing your way into a Nobel-worthy discovery.
Oh, completely.
He was injecting rats with ovarian extracts, convinced he was going to find a specific, undiscovered female sex hormone. But instead, his rats kept developing this identical triad of internal damage.
Right. The same 3 things every time?
Yeah, they had massive enlarged adrenal cortices, their immune systems, specifically the lymph nodes and thymus shriveled up, and they developed severe stomach ulcers.
The frustration he must have felt is palpable, because it wasn't just the ovarian extract doing it. He realized that any noxious substance he injected caused the exact same damage.
Literally anything.
Yeah. If he exposed the rats to freezing cold or surgical trauma or even just physically restrained them, the same triad appeared. Big adrenal glands, shrunken immune system, ulcers.
So he thought his experiment was a total failure because he couldn't isolate a specific reaction.
But that failure was the breakthrough. Selye realized the body doesn't just have specific responses to specific injuries.
There's a general alarm.
Exactly, a generic, generalized alarm system that activates no matter what demand is placed on it. And he actually borrowed a word from structural engineering to describe this physical wear and tear. He called it stress. And he published this biological model as the general adaptation syndrome.
So if Selye proved this universal alarm system exists, what is the actual physical switch inside the body that flips it?
Well, that brings us to the chemistry of the cortex itself, the outer layer.
Yeah.
The outer cortex is divided into 3 concentric zones, and medical students use a great mnemonic to remember what they produce. GFR, which stands for the anatomical names of the layers, but they map it to salt, sugar, sex.
Okay, let's break down the salt layer first.
So the outermost layer is the zona glomerulosa. It produces a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids, named because they regulate minerals, primarily sodium.
Okay.
The main hormone here is aldosterone. Aldosterone's entire job is to travel to your kidneys, find the microscopic tubes where urine is made, and tell them to hoard sodium back into the blood.
And because water universally follows salt in the body, hoarding sodium means you retain water.
Exactly. Which increases your overall blood volume and physically drives up your blood pressure.
That makes sense.
It's the effector hormone of something called the RAAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. If you suffer a major physical trauma and start bleeding, or your blood pressure suddenly drops, this is the elegant, self-contained system that steps in to aggressively clamp down on your fluid loss so you don't pass out.
Right, so that's salt. Moving one layer deeper, we hit the middle, thickest layer, which is the zona fasciculata. This is the sugar layer. And this is the famous one where cortisol comes from.
Yeah, cortisol is a glucocorticoid. Gluco for glucose, cortico for cortex, oid for steroid.
Right.
Its primary job during a stress response is to mobilize energy, specifically by raising your blood sugar. It tells the liver to start synthesizing new glucose from scratch. And it simultaneously stops other tissues in your body from using that glucose, effectively hoarding all available fuel for your brain and skeletal muscles so you can survive the immediate threat.
And it also suppresses your immune and inflammatory responses, right? Like basically shutting down long-term repair projects to focus all metabolic energy on the emergency at hand.
Exactly.
But this isn't just a random flood of hormones. It is highly regulated by the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis.
Yeah, let's visualize how that axis communicates.
I always think of it like a thermostat in your house. The hypothalamus in your brain is the thermostat on the wall. It senses the environment, and if it detects a threat, it sends a chemical signal, CRH, down a tiny stalk to the pituitary gland, which acts like the relay switch.
Right.
The pituitary then sends that ACTH signal we talked about earlier through the blood to the adrenal gland, which is the furnace.
Right.
And the adrenal gland pumps out the heat, which is the cortisol.
That analogy holds up perfectly, actually, because it illustrates the negative feedback loop. Once the room gets hot enough, meaning once cortisol levels in the blood get high enough, that cortisol physically travels back up to the brain.
And turns it off.
Yeah, it binds to receptors on the hypothalamus and essentially says, okay, the furnace is blazing, we have enough heat, turn the signal off. The system regulates itself.
And cortisol isn't just for emergencies, right? Like if you are listening to this while drinking your morning coffee, your cortisol is actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Oh, absolutely. It follows a strict circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
Your cortisol peaks sharply about 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up.
Really?
Yeah, it's an evolutionary mechanism called the cortisol awakening response. It quite literally gets you out of bed, raises your blood pressure slightly, and prepares your metabolism for the day.
And then it drops off.
Exactly. And it slowly falls, hitting its lowest point around midnight so you can fall asleep.
Okay, so we've covered salt and sugar. The innermost layer of the cortex is the sex layer, the zona reticularis.
Right, and this layer produces androgens, primarily one called DHEA. Interestingly, DHEA is the most abundant steroid hormone circulating in human blood.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, but it doesn't do much on its own. It acts as a raw material, like a floating precursor. Other tissues in your body can grab DHEA out of the blood and convert it locally into more potent androgens and estrogen.
Okay, so it's a supply line.
Very much so. It is incredibly important as a source of sex hormones for children before puberty and for women after menopause when the ovaries stop producing their primary supply.
So all of that complex chemistry, the salt retention, the glucose mobilization, the sex hormone precursors, that is all happening in the slow burn mesodermal tissue of the cortex.
Exactly.
But then we cross the border into the medulla, the inner core,
Yeah.
the modified brain tissue.
And the rules change entirely here. The medulla is made of modified nerve cells called chromaffin cells. When the sympathetic nervous system senses acute danger, it fires an electrical signal straight down into the medulla.
And how fast is that?
The response happens in seconds, not minutes or hours like the cortex. About 80% of what the medulla dumps into the blood is epinephrine, so adrenaline, and 20% is norepinephrine.
I think the most visceral way to understand what the medulla does is to look at an EpiPen. Most people don't realize an EpiPen is just a synthetic, external version of your own adrenal medulla.
That's a great way to put it.
Because during anaphylactic shock from a severe allergy, your blood pressure collapses and your airway swells shut.
And an EpiPen delivers a massive synthetic dose of epinephrine straight into the muscle. It forces a physiological override.
Right.
It brutally constricts the blood vessels to violently push blood pressure back up while simultaneously relaxing the smooth muscles in the airways so you can breathe.
It's basically an instant reboot.
Yeah, it proves the sheer mechanical power of the medulla's output. It is a massive whole-body broadcast of an emergency signal.
Which perfectly illustrates the classic fight-or-flight concept. Physiologist Walter Bradford Cannon coined that phrase way back in 1915.
He did.
But modern research shows that Cannon's catchy phrase is missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Well, Cannon's model was foundational, but in the year 2000, a psychologist named Shelley Taylor published a major critique. She pointed out that the fight-or-flight research had historically been heavily male-dominated, both in terms of the scientists conducting the research and the animal models they used in the labs.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, so Taylor argued that under stress, many organisms, and she particularly highlighted human females, exhibit a tend and befriend response.
Tend and befriend, meaning your instinct isn't necessarily to run away or punch the threat.
Right.
Your instinct might be to protect your offspring, seek out social affiliation, and look for safety in numbers.
Exactly. Biologically, this response is mediated not just by cortisol and adrenaline, but by oxytocin, the bonding hormone, which is released during stress as well.
Okay.
Other researchers also point to the freeze response, literally playing dead or becoming immobile, as a third default option.
So it's not just fight or flight.
No, and what this reveals is a crucial distinction. The adrenaline from your medulla dictates your level of physiological arousal, providing the massive burst of energy.
Right.
But it does not hardwire the specific behavior you will choose to execute with that energy.
So adrenaline just gives you the raw fuel, but your brain decides whether to use that fuel to run, fight, freeze, or grab a friend.
Precisely.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating biological realities of the modern world. Robert Sapolsky's research on baboons and his famous book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Sapolsky's work is brilliant because he highlights a fundamental flaw in how humans use this perfectly evolved system. A zebra uses its HPA axis exactly as nature intended.
How so?
While a lion jumps out of the tall grass, the zebra's hypothalamus triggers the adrenal glands, cortisol and adrenaline flood the system, blood pressure spikes, and the zebra has a frantic 3-minute sprint for its life.
And 3 minutes later, the biological event is over. The zebra either got away and goes back to peacefully eating grass, or it's dead. The stress response shuts off. But humans, we turn on that exact same physiological machinery, the cortisol, the blood pressure spike, the immune suppression. But we do it because we're worried about our 401k, or a toxic boss, or a looming deadline.
Exactly.
We use a 3-minute survival system for a 30-year career of abstract financial anxiety.
And this introduces the concept of allostasis. We mentioned homeostasis earlier, maintaining a stable internal environment. Allostasis is the active process of achieving that stability through change.
Okay, modifying things on the fly.
Yes, your body alters its blood pressure or heart rate to meet a challenge, but when you are chronically stressed, you develop an allostatic load. The physical wear and tear of constantly running that stress response turns a survival mechanism into a driver of modern disease.
Like what?
It causes metabolic syndrome, hypertension, and immune suppression. A glandular system built for sprints is being forced to run a marathon.
Which naturally brings up a diagnosis you see constantly on the internet right now. Adrenal fatigue. People claim their adrenals are literally exhausted from modern life, that the factory is burned out and can't produce enough cortisol anymore.
Right, you hear that everywhere.
Let's look at the actual science behind that. What do the sources say?
Major endocrine societies are definitive on this. Adrenal fatigue is not recognized as a legitimate medical diagnosis.
Wait, really? Not at all?
Not at all. The feelings of fatigue, the brain fog, the burnout, those are very real. Chronic stress is real.
Okay.
But the idea that the adrenal glands themselves are tired or failing to produce cortisol because they are overworked is physiologically incorrect. True adrenal failure is Addison's disease, which we discussed, an autoimmune or infectious destruction of the tissue.
So if the glands aren't tired, what is actually causing that feeling of burnout?
It's an issue of receptor downregulation.
What does that mean?
If your boss yells at you every day, your adrenal glands don't run out of cortisol. They actually pump out tons of it. But your brain and tissues, trying to protect themselves from this constant toxic flood of glucose-mobilizing hormone start removing their own cortisol receptors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the brain essentially puts on noise-canceling headphones. The adrenal factory is still pumping out the product, but the cellular shipping receivers have locked their doors.
That is a great analogy.
That's why you feel fatigued, not because the gland is broken, but because the entire HPA axis has downregulated its sensitivity.
And there is a critical danger to misunderstanding this, according to our deep dive sourcing.
Yes, a very real danger.
If a practitioner diagnoses you with fake adrenal fatigue and prescribes you unregulated glucocorticoids, basically steroid pills to, quote-unquote, support your adrenals, it can be incredibly dangerous.
Because of that negative feedback loop we mapped out earlier, if you take artificial steroid pills, your brain senses all this synthetic cortisol in the blood.
Right.
It thinks the adrenal glands are working overtime, so the hypothalamus completely shuts off the natural ACTH signal. You suppress your own HPA axis.
It stops telling your body to make it.
Exactly. If you then stop taking those unregulated steroids abruptly, your natural adrenal glands are basically asleep. They can't wake up fast enough to produce the cortisol you need for basic survival, and you can go into a life-threatening adrenal crisis.
That is terrifying. Okay, let's do a quick sweep of two other common misconceptions before we wrap up. First, the idea that cortisol is just the stress hormone, and therefore it is purely toxic and bad for you.
We can put that to rest entirely. As we noted with the morning wake-up response, cortisol regulates your baseline blood sugar and blood pressure.
So you need it.
Desperately. A total absence of cortisol is fatal within days. The poison is strictly in the dose and the duration. It's the chronic elevation that causes harm, not the hormone itself.
Right, okay. And the second misconception. Adrenaline is only released by the adrenal glands.
Also false. Most of the norepinephrine that actually drives specific fight or flight effects on your organs, like making your heart beat faster, comes from local sympathetic nerve endings located right next to those target organs.
Okay, so what does the adrenal gland do then?
The adrenal medulla's specific job is to dump a massive amount of epinephrine into the general blood supply as a backup, whole-body broadcast, ensuring the signal hits tissues that the nerves might not directly reach.
When we pull all this anatomical history and chemistry together, why does understanding this 4-gram double organ matter for the average person listening?
Because the adrenal glands sit right at the intersection of modern medicine's biggest hurdles. If you want to understand how to manage workplace burnout, you are really talking about modulating the HPA axis. If you have asthma or an autoimmune disease and you take synthetic corticosteroid medications, you are directly manipulating that exact negative feedback loop. Understanding how this dual organ acts as the master integrator of our daily survival isn't just medical trivia. It is the biological foundation of how we navigate the stressors of the modern world.
It bridges the gap between our psychological worries and our physical reality. Something weighing no more than 2 paper clips actually translates the abstract stress of an email into a physical pounding heartbeat.
It does, and it leaves us with a fascinating, almost provocative question to consider.
What's that?
Well, the adrenal system evolved over millions of years, perfectly tuned to handle acute physical threats like running from predators. But our modern environment is now permanently saturated with abstract psychological stressors that never actually resolve.
Right, the 30-year career anxiety.
Exactly. So are our adrenal glands currently caught in a massive evolutionary mismatch? And if so, how might human physiology be forced to adapt to this biological panic button over the next 10,000 years of evolution?
A physiological system built for the savannah, currently trapped in a cubicle. It makes you wonder what those 2 paper clips in our lower backs are going to look like a few millennia from now.